As America entered the second half of the 19th century, decades of bitter wrangling pitted two sections of this young nation against one another. A war was brewing that would severely divide its citizenry. Northerners called it the War of the Rebellion. Southerners, the war between the states. We know it today simply as the Civil War. It lasted 4 long years, from April 1861 to April 1865, and ravaged much of the eastern United States. This struggle, which cost 627,000 lives, decided whether American democracy and freedoms could coexist with slavery. In the North, a once rural economy was rapidly giving way to industry, which favored free labor. The South, however, clung to its agrarian ways, with slavery firmly embedded in the economic structure. As a border state with a middle temperament, Maryland embodied both. It was a slaveholding state that did not support Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 presidential election, and it was a state that never withdrew from the Union. Lincoln knew that the capital city, Washington, was vulnerable to attacks by way of Maryland's neighbor, Virginia. Accordingly, Lincoln believed that Montgomery County, Maryland, must be secured at all costs. The weakest point was this: the Potomac River. It was easy to cross by ferry or by wading on foot. The entire state of Maryland was placed under martial law. Search warrants were not required. Citizens could be jailed without a trial, and their property could be seized. Fear and uneasiness prevailed, and some residents took up arms to form companies of guards, all to protect their homes, their farms, and their families. For 4 long years, the people of Montgomery County endured life in a war zone. Hello, I'm Greg Lewis, and I'll be leading you on this journey, exploring some of Montgomery County's important Civil War sites and stories. 150 years ago, our county looked very different. To truly relate, we have to imagine life in 1860. So let's try to go back in time. Welcome to Stony Castle, just outside of Poolesville. It was built before the Civil War, around 1830, and was the family farm of Stephen and Mary Veers White. One of their sons, Elijah, was one of the most well-known rebels born in Montgomery County. There'll be more about him later. But first, look around. 150 years ago, large farms like this were becoming common in Montgomery County. Farming was how most people made their living, and between the farms was mostly forest. Rockville, so named only 50 years earlier, was our largest town. Before that, it was known simply as Montgomery Courthouse. Tiny communities were scattered throughout the land. They served the nearby farmers as well as travelers passing through. Roads were mostly made of dirt that often washed away during storms. It took a full day to travel on horseback from the newly formed city of Washington to Rockville, our county seat. Just before the Civil War, the county's population totaled only 18,000. 1/4, or about 4,500 people, was African American. Of that number, approximately 1/3 were free. The rest were enslaved, working as farmhands, household servants, or craftsmen. They were considered property and enjoyed few, if any, rights. Josiah Henson, one of this county's most famous slaves, wrote these words about a beating he once received.
Besides my broken arm and the wounds on my head, I could feel and hear the pieces of my shoulder blades grate against each other with every breath. No physician or surgeon was called to dress my wounds, and I never knew one to be called to a slave on this estate. I was attended, if it may be called attendance, by my master's sister. She splintered my arm and bound up my back as well as she knew how, and nature did the rest. It was 5 months before I could work at all.
Henson's autobiography inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. This house and log structure are all that is left of the farm of Isaac and Matilda Riley. Josiah Henson was enslaved on this land in what is now North Bethesda. Today, it's the Josiah Henson Historical Park, part of the Montgomery County Department of Parks. This cultural resource portrays Henson's life and the Maryland slave experience. The museum will open within the next several years. Montgomery County's proximity to the Free State of Pennsylvania gave it an important role in the Underground Railroad. Not a railroad at all. This was a secret alliance of people who helped conduct freedom seekers on their journey northward. It's believed that the Quakers of Sandy Spring and Brookville helped coordinate the Underground Railroad in Montgomery County. One young girl who escaped enslavement is Anne Maria Weems. Her story is told in a young adult book, Stealing Freedom. She was the property of a Rockville slave trader named Charles Price. Disguised as a coach boy, this brave 13-year-old traveled hundreds of miles along the Underground Railroad to her freedom in Canada. Today, visitors can hike the 2-mile Underground Experience Trail here at Woodlawn Manor Cultural Park in Sandy Spring. The trail demonstrates what it was like to be a runaway slave and commemorates the involvement of county residents in the Underground Railroad. This beautiful stone barn is being converted to a visitor center designed to explore the themes of the Underground Railroad and the Quaker experience in Montgomery County. At the outbreak of the Civil War, about 1/3 of the county's white population owned slaves. William Palmer, a Quaker physician who lived here at Woodlawn, was one of them. Like Palmer, most county slaveholders held fewer than 10 slaves. Brookville landowner Allen Bowie Davis owned the most, with about 100. Ironically, Davis was a staunch Union man. This surprising combination was more common than you might think. Southern sympathizers, Secesh as they came to be known, which is short for secessionists, were plentiful in Montgomery County. Matthew Fields, editor of the Sentinel newspaper, was a vocal supporter of the Southern states. He repeatedly ran fiery articles to champion their cause, which in later years landed him in prison. Soon after Confederates overran Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, these words appeared in his newspaper.
Civil war is upon us. It is hardly necessary to declare our position. The most casual reader of the Sentinel knows already. We believe that right and justice are with the South. At present, we can only wait and watch events while holding ourselves in readiness to do whatever will be required in defense of our state's rights against the centralized despotism of Republican rule in Washington, D.C.
In the spring of 1861, after the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter that launched the Civil War, President Lincoln called for a volunteer army from each state. Confident of a Union victory, they were asked to serve for a mere 3 months. Many men came forward to help protect the Union. These federal troops, mostly Northerners wearing blue uniforms, came to be known as Yankees. Southerners volunteering for the Confederate Army, mostly wearing gray uniforms, became known as the Rebels. Unlike most other parts of the country, Montgomery County was a place where pro-slavery and anti-slavery Americans lived right next door to one another. Here, the Civil War literally pitted neighbor against neighbor. Many county men enlisted with the Army of the North, but many others joined the South. Sometimes they even met on the battlefield. The first military draft was carried out in July of 1863. This is the list of men who were chosen from Montgomery County that day. Notice the words, "gone south," after many of them. Those men had slipped away to fight with the Confederates. In all, about 200 Montgomery County men went south. If they survived, they dared not visit home. That's because the county was occupied by federal troops. I'll tell you more about that when we return.